Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we are diving into a chapter of history that smells. Well, let's just say it didn't smell great, and it involves consuming things that polite society usually buries. Trust me, being sick in medieval or early modern times was nothing like a modern trip to the doctor. Unless your modern doctor offers you a side of powdered human skull with your aspirin. So before we dive into this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, which tonight might make you question both my sanity and yours. Now, get ready for a journey. Because tonight we're easing into history together, into its strange and sometimes unsettling depths. The depths where medicine and the dead became ingredients. You stand in a room that feels cold and damp, even if it's not. The air itself seems heavy, carrying the faint, unsettling scent of dust, decay, and something else you can't quite place, not spices, not herbs, but something profoundly organic and wrong. Before you, illuminated by the weak light filtering through a small window or perhaps the flicker of a single candle, sits a small, rough-hewn table. On it are vials made of cloudy glass, ceramic pots with loose lids, and a simple scale. And then you see the main event, a small, dark, lumpy powder, perhaps in a folded piece of paper or a tiny linen bag. It's not uniform, you can make out different textures, perhaps even tiny, glittering fragments if you look closely enough. This isn't simply dried plant matter, it's something far more disturbing. The apothecary, a figure whose face is obscured by shadow but whose hands move with practiced efficiency, measures out a small amount of the powder onto the scale. The scraping sound of the dry material against the metal pan sends a shiver through you. It feels profoundly wrong, this act, like watching someone prepare forbidden food. You are here because you are ill. Perhaps you suffer from the falling sickness, epilepsy, which strikes unpredictably, violently, robbing you of control, feared and misunderstood by everyone. Or maybe it's severe bruising, internal bleeding from a fall, or some other persistent ailment that defies conventional remedies. You are desperate, your family is desperate, and this is the prescribed cure. You feel a knot of revulsion tighten in your stomach. Your mind screams for you to turn and run, to reject this abomination. Yet the desire to be well, to escape the suffering, pins you in place. You watch as the apothecary reaches for a jug of wine, often used to wash down these grim remedies, perhaps to mask the taste, perhaps believed to enhance their power. The dark powder is mixed into the liquid, swirling slowly, creating a muddy, unappetizing concoction. The smell intensifies slightly, the faint, earthy odor of decay mingling with the sour smell of the wine. It's a smell that feels ancient and deeply unsettling, a primal alarm bell ringing in your brain. You are about to consume death, transformed into medicine, and the thought is almost unbearable. Zooming out from your immediate, nauseating predicament, this wasn't some rare, dark secret practiced by a few village witches. The use of human remains in medicine, a practice known as anthropophagy or corporeal medicine, was a widely accepted, even fashionable, form of treatment across Europe for centuries, roughly from the late medieval period through the 18th century. It was endorsed by respected physicians, detailed in formal medical texts, and consumed by people from all walks of life, including royalty. The logic, bizarre as it seems now, was often rooted in sympathetic magic, the belief that you could transfer the vitality or power of the deceased to the sick. For instance, blood from gladiators or executed criminals was prized for treating epilepsy because their life force was seen as potent and abruptly released at death. The idea was that this sudden burst of vitality could somehow reset or strengthen the failing body or wandering spirit of the epileptic. This practice highlights a world utterly alien to our own medical understanding. It shows a time when the lines between life, death, and healing were perceived very differently, and where desperation, superstition, and nascent, misguided scientific inquiry intersected in the most unsettling ways imaginable. The dead body was not just something to be mourned and buried. It was a potential pharmacopoeia, a source of potent, albeit grim, ingredients. This wasn't merely poverty-driven cannibalism for sustenance. It was a deliberate, structured medical practice, a testament to human credulity and the lengths people would go to escape pain and the terrifying inevitability of death in an era with few effective alternatives. Your journey through the shadows was far from over, and what you discovered next was even stranger and perhaps more disturbing. You've just been introduced to the grim reality of consuming human remains for health, a concept that twists your stomach even now. The dark powder the apothecary measured out wasn't just symbolically linked to death. It was death packaged and sold as medicine, and the names given to these substances are as stark and unsettling as the ingredients themselves. You might hear physicians or apothecaries speak of mummy, not in reference to ancient Egyptian artifacts in a museum which, bizarrely, they eventually became, but as a medicinal compound derived from actual human bodies. Or perhaps spirit of skull, referring to the lichens scraped from human crania exposed to the elements, believed to hold unique healing properties because of its macabre growing medium. Human fat, rendered down and used topically or internally, was another common ingredient, valued for its purported ability to soothe aches and heal wounds. The sheer literalness of these names underscores how normalized this practice was, how deeply embedded it became in the medical lexicon. Imagine the conversations surrounding these remedies. You might hear whispers in the marketplace or among the learned, discussing the best sauce for mummy, whether genuine Egyptian was superior to the readily available fakes made from local corpses. Yes, you heard that right. The demand for human remains as medicine became so high, and genuine Egyptian mummies so scarce and expensive, that a booming industry in counterfeit mummy sprang up. Suppliers would prepare the bodies of recently deceased beggars, criminals, or plague victims, drying and treating them to resemble the real thing. This adds a layer of grim irony and profound exploitation to the practice. A wealthy nobleman, paying a fortune for what he believed was ancient, potent Egyptian king, might instead be consuming the body of a pauper who died last week, prepared under the most unsanitary conditions imaginable. The fraud within this macabre market highlights that even death and supposed dignity were commodities, subject to the era's ruthless economics and casual disregard for the marginalized. Consider the practicalities, the logistics of this trade in human parts. who sourced these bodies. Grave robbers certainly played a role, operating under the cover of darkness in cemeteries and at execution sites. Apothecaries and surgeons sometimes had access to bodies of executed criminals, legally permitted for anatomical study, but often diverted into the medicinal trade. You picture the clandestine transactions, the handling of decaying flesh, the grinding of bone and tissue. In a world utterly ignorant of germ theory, the potential for contamination and the spread of disease through these preparations was terrifyingly high. Instead of curing ailments, these medicines were likely vectors for infection, turning a desperate attempt at healing into a literal consumption of illness. The paradox is chilling. Seeking life by ingesting death, and often finding death in the process. This flourishing, gruesome trade reveals a dark side of history where human bodies, post-mortem, lost their inherent respect and became raw materials in a bizarre, often dangerous pharmacological industry. And in that unsettling stillness, something truly stark began to stir. You've paid, the grim transaction is complete, and the moment of truth has arrived. The apothecary or physician hands you the cup, perhaps a small wooden bowl or a crude ceramic mug. The liquid inside is dark, murky, opaque. You cannot see the bottom. It might be wine, ale, or even water, but whatever the base, it carries the heavy presence of its active ingredient. You hesitate for just a fraction of a second, every fiber of your being recoiling. This feels less like taking medicine and more like an act of profound violation against yourself, against the natural order of things. But the pain, the fear of your illness, the desperate hope overrides the instinctive revulsion. You raise the cup to your lips. The smell is the first assault, earthy, musty, perhaps with a faint, unsettling sweetness like something decaying or dried out for too long. If it's mixed with wine, the fermented smell is there, but it doesn't mask the underlying odor of something fundamentally not meant for consumption. As the liquid touches your tongue, the texture is immediately apparent. It's not smooth. There's a grittiness, a chalkiness, perhaps tiny, hard particles scraping against the roof of your mouth. If it's powdered mummy or bone, you are literally feeling the pulverized remains of a human body. The taste is bitter, foul, utterly alien. It's a taste that registers on a primal level as danger, spoilage, death. Your gag reflex kicks in, a powerful, involuntary contraction in your throat urging you to expel this horrific substance. You have to force it down, swallowing hard, the gritty liquid coating your throat, leaving a lingering, foul residue. A shiver runs through your body, not from cold, but from the sheer wrongness of the act. This wasn't just about drinking foul concoctions. Imagine you have a badly bruised limb, swollen and painful, perhaps due to a fall. The remedy prescribed might be a salve or ointment made from human fat, often sourced from executed criminals. You feel the strange, yielding texture of the rendered fat as it's applied to your skin, the faint, animalistic smell warming with your body heat. It's greasy, heavy, absorbing slowly, or sometimes just sitting on the surface. The tactile experience is unsettling. This material that was once part of another human being is now being rubbed into your flesh. The boundary feels permeable, the distinction between bodies disturbingly blurred. But this wasn't just your personal ordeal or the practice of isolated individuals. Zooming out, these remedies were firmly entrenched in the formal medical knowledge of the time. They weren't backalley folk cures whispered about in secret. They were listed in official pharmacopoeias, the authoritative guides for apothecaries and physicians, the equivalent of a modern medical formulary or drug index. You could find entries like Mumia, mummy, Usnea cranii humani, moss from a human skull, and Axungia hominis, human fat printed in widely circulated texts, complete with descriptions of their preparation and uses. This lent them an air of absolute legitimacy, backed by the authority of learned medical practitioners and institutions. The reasoning behind their use, while flawed from our modern perspective, often followed a twisted internal logic. Skull moss was used for head ailments like epilepsy, nosebleeds, and headaches because it grew on a skull, the seat of these issues. Mummy was a panacea, a general cure-all, perhaps because the Egyptians who were embalmed were seen as having cheated death or possessed ancient, potent knowledge. Human fat, being soft tissue, was believed to be good for other soft tissue ailments like bruises and sprains. This is sympathetic magic codified into medicine, a belief that the properties of the source material, its origin, its state dead, its perceived vitality, could be transferred to the patient. It highlights a fundamental misunderstanding of anatomy, physiology, and disease transmission, where symbolic connections held more sway than empirical evidence. This blend of accepted knowledge, ancient superstition, and sheer desperation created a medical landscape where consuming death was not only accepted, but prescribed, illustrating just how different the fight for survival looked in the past. You've just swallowed a dose of history's darkest medicine, feeling the gritty residue and the lingering, foul taste. But where exactly did that powder, that fat, that strange moss come from? The transformation of a human body into a medicinal ingredient was a process often as gruesome and unsettling as its consumption. Take the powdered skull or spirit of skull. This wasn't just about picking up bones. It involved meticulously cleaning, drying, and then grinding down sections of the human cranium into a fine powder using a mortar and pestle. You can almost hear the repetitive thud scrape of the heavy pestle against the hard bone in the mortar, the dust that would rise, carrying the faint, dry, ancient smell of calcium and something else. The belief was that the very structure that housed the brain, the seat of maladies like epilepsy and headaches, must contain the essence of the cure. This wasn't recycling. It was a form of pharmacological resurrection, turning bone into a therapeutic agent. Or consider the human fat, or Axungia hominis, prized for treating bruises, sprains, and even gout. This involved rendering down fatty tissue, similar to how animal fat is rendered for cooking or soap making. You picture chunks of human tissue heated slowly in a pot, the fat melting away, releasing its distinct, heavy odor, perhaps mixed with the scent of decay depending on the freshness of the source material. The liquid fat would then be strained and stored in jars or pots, a pale, oily, unsettling substance. This wasn't just abstract. This was someone's former body, now a greasy salve to be rubbed into your aching muscles or swollen joints. And the infamous mummy. While genuine Egyptian mummies were used, looted from tombs, and shipped across continents, the demand far outstripped the supply. As we touched on earlier, this led to the creation of a massive, dark market for fake mummy. Bodies of the recently deceased, often executed criminals, the poor or victims of plague, were prepared to resemble the real thing. This could involve drying the corpses, sometimes treating them with bitumen or spices, and then grinding them down. Imagine the sheer volume of bodies needed to sustain this demand across Europe for centuries, the number of graves disturbed, the indignity inflicted upon the dead, all for a substance believed to be a miracle cure. The scale of this grisly enterprise highlights a truly uncomfortable aspect of history, the industrialization of death for profit and perceived health benefits. Zooming out, these substances weren't niche remedies for obscure ailments. They were prescribed for an astonishingly wide range of conditions. Spirit of skull wasn't just for epilepsy, it was also used for paralysis, vertigo, and even melancholy. Human fat was used for everything from skin conditions and wound healing to internal ailments. Mummy was a panacea, recommended for everything from coughs and stomach troubles to plague and internal bleeding. The logic, however flawed, was consistent. Target the ailment with a substance sourced from a body believed to possess a relevant property, whether it was vitality, strength, or merely proximity, like the skull for head issues. This wasn't a sign of limited belief, but rather a sign of how deeply ingrained these ideas were, how seamlessly they fit into the prevailing, albeit misguided, medical understanding. What's particularly striking, and adds a layer of dark irony, is that these remedies were not confined to the poor or uneducated. Royalty, nobles, wealthy merchants, they all used these medicines. King Charles II of England, for example, was known to use spirit of skull for his epilepsy, even reportedly distilling his own supply. This wasn't a secret, shameful practice of the underclass. It was part of the medical mainstream, consumed by the elite who could afford the often high prices of these gruesome ingredients. It underscores how pervasive the belief in corporeal medicine was, cutting across social strata and highlighting the shared desperation and sometimes terrifying credulity that characterized the pursuit of health in a world with few effective medical interventions. You might shiver at the thought of the source, but for the people involved in this trade, it was often just another job, albeit a grim one. Imagine the grave robbers working in the dead of night, the shovel biting into the earth, the sound muffled by the darkness. They weren't just seeking jewels or valuables, they were after the body itself, a commodity in the burgeoning medicinal market. Picture the damp soil, the smell of disturbed earth mixing with something far more potent and unpleasant as they reach the coffin. The physical labor, the secrecy, the ethical violation, all undertaken for profit, because a body, fresh or otherwise, had a price. Executed criminals were a particularly convenient source, their bodies often legally available to surgeons and physicians, ostensibly for dissection and study, but frequently diverted into the lucrative drug trade. The scaffold became an unwitting supplier for the apothecaries' shelf, but the acquisition was only the first step. The processing was equally grim. If it was mummy being prepared, the body needed to be dried and preserved. For the counterfeit market, This might involve disemboweling and treating the corpse with heat, spices, or even bitumen, a process that would fill any nearby space with a cloying, sweet, and utterly nauseating smell. Imagine the workshops where this happened, the air thick with the stench of decay and chemicals, the sight of human bodies being processed like raw materials. This wasn't sterile surgery. It was industrial-scale gruesome preparation, a dark parody of embalming focused purely on creating a saleable medical product. For Spirit of Skull, someone had to collect skulls, let them sit until moss grew, and then meticulously scrape it off, perhaps cleaning the bone beforehand. Every single ingredient, every powder, every salve, every liquid required direct, physical interaction with human remains at various stages of decomposition. Now, let's zoom out and grasp the scale of this. This wasn't a fringe practice. It lasted for centuries across most of Europe. Think about the amount of mummy, spirit of skull, and human fat listed in pharmacopoeias, prescribed by doctors and consumed by people from all walks of life. If we make a very rough, conservative estimate, and historical data here is fragmented and complex, consider this. If across Europe, just 1,000 active apothecaries and physicians used an average of, say, material equivalent to just half a body per year for their various preparations, across the 300 years, roughly 1500 to 1800, that the practice was most widespread, that amounts to potentially 150,000 human bodies being processed for medicinal purposes over that period. 150,000. That number isn't a precise count, but it gives you a sense of the immense, unsettling scale of this trade built on death. It wasn't just a few bodies here and there. It was an industry, requiring a constant supply line of corpses, fueling grave robbing, desecration, and a macabre form of human exploitation. This staggering number reveals a truly stark reality. A society where the demand for health treatments was so desperate, and the ethical boundaries regarding the dead so permeable, that a massive, multi-century trade in human remains became normalized. It highlights a profound cultural blind spot, where the living, in their frantic pursuit of well-being, actively participated in the commodification and consumption of the dead, often the most vulnerable members of that very society. The irony is thick enough to cut with a burial spade, seeking life and vitality by consuming death, often sourced from those whose lives were already cut short by poverty, disease, or the brutal justice system. This dark commercial enterprise wasn't some ancient, quickly forgotten aberration. It was a sustained, widespread reality that casts a long, unsettling shadow on the history of medicine and human belief. And in that unsettling stillness, something truly stark began to stir. But your journey through the shadows was far from over, and what you discovered next was even stranger and perhaps more disturbing. You've contemplated the vast number of bodies processed, but the grim details go even deeper. It wasn't just powdered bone and rendered fat. Physicians sought out specific parts of the body, each believed to hold unique, potent properties linked to the ailments they aimed to cure. Consider human blood. Freshly drawn blood, particularly from vigorous young men who had died violently, executed criminals being ideal, was sometimes recommended for epilepsy. The idea was that the sudden, violent release of life force in death could counteract the violent seizures of epilepsy. You can almost picture the scene: someone standing near the scaffold, cup in hand, waiting for the executioner's work to be done, ready to collect the still warm blood. The metallic smell, the sticky texture, the warmth, it's a visceral image that cuts through centuries, a stark reminder of the lengths people would go to and the beliefs that drove them. Then there were the internal organs. The heart, as the perceived seat of vitality and courage, was sometimes incorporated into remedies for weakness or fear. The liver, associated with blood production and humors, might be used for related ailments. Imagine the process: the removal of the organ, its preparation, perhaps drying, grinding, or boiling. The smells that would emanate from such work are almost unimaginable today, a potent mix of decay and cooking, turning a sacred or vital part of the body into a raw ingredient. Bone marrow, too, was utilized, believed to hold regenerative properties, perhaps used for joint issues or weakness. You might be told to consume a broth made with human bones, sipping a liquid that carried the essence of another person's skeletal structure. Let's zoom out for a moment and connect this to the medical framework of the time. While seemingly barbaric to us, these practices coexisted, sometimes uncomfortably, with the emerging field of anatomical study. As dissection became more common in medical schools and by physicians, the interior of the human body was being systematically explored and documented. This could have, you might think, led to a greater reverence for the body, a deeper understanding that would make consumption unthinkable. But paradoxically, for some, greater familiarity with the physical form seemed to reinforce the belief in its constituent parts as potential remedies. Anatomy revealed the physical substance of life, and that substance, in the absence of effective pharmacology, was viewed as a potential source of healing power. Physicians, dissecting corpses by day, might prescribe remedies derived from them by night, seeing no inherent conflict within their framework. The very act of seeing the body's complexity sometimes fueled the idea that its parts held potent secrets. The logic, though often a blend of ancient humoral theory, sympathetic magic, and observation, however flawed, was taken seriously. If a body was full of life force, consuming part of it could give you life force. If an organ was crucial for a bodily function, consuming it could strengthen that function in your own body. This wasn't seen universally as pure superstition by practitioners. It was a rational, within their paradigm, attempt to harness perceived natural properties. It highlights the immense gap between their understanding of biology and ours, where correlation was often mistaken for causation, and symbolic meaning trumped empirical evidence. What's particularly bizarre is the precise sourcing. Sometimes specific types of death were sought out. Bodies of those who died naturally from old age were considered less potent than those who died young or violently. The belief was that a life force, slowly extinguished by age, wouldn't transfer well, whereas a life force abruptly and violently released would be powerful. This led to a preference for executed criminals or even victims of duels or accidents, adding another layer of grim irony to the practice, seeking health from those whose lives were brutally cut short, often by violence or injustice. Consider the financial aspect too. These weren't cheap remedies. Mummy and spirit of skull were often expensive luxury goods in the apothecary shop, reflecting the difficulty and risk in acquiring the raw materials. A single dose could cost a significant amount, placing it out of reach for the very poor, ironically, the demographic from which the bodies were often sourced. This grotesque economic loop underscores the profound inequalities of the time, where the wealthy literally consumed the poor and marginalized in their pursuit of health, a chilling metaphor for exploitation that cuts across centuries. It reveals how power, wealth, and desperation intersected in the most uncomfortable ways imaginable, turning human remains into high-value commodities in a market driven by fear of illness and hope for survival. And in that unsettling stillness, something truly stark began to stir. You've just contemplated the sheer, unsettling volume of bodies processed, a truly industrial-scale appropriation of the dead for the living's perceived benefit. Now, let's zoom in on the specific instructions you might receive when handed your dose of powdered skull or human fat. This wasn't just about downing a pill. There were often specific times, conditions, or rituals recommended to enhance the remedy's effectiveness. You might be told to take spirit of skull during certain lunar phases or at a specific time of day, perhaps dawn when the world is waking, or midnight, closer to the realm of the dead. The method of ingestion mattered too. Was it to be mixed with warm wine, cold water, or perhaps stirred into a gruel? You carefully follow the instructions, feeling the weight of centuries of belief and desperate hope behind each step. The psychological element is crucial here. You are not just consuming a substance, you are performing an act laden with meaning, connecting you directly to the dead. As you lift the cup, knowing its contents, you might feel a strange mixture of dread and awe, a sense of tapping into a power both forbidden and potentially miraculous. The grittiness on your tongue, the foul smell, these weren't just unpleasant side effects. They might be interpreted as signs of the remedy's potency, proof that something powerful, something real, was at work within your body. The worse it tasted, perhaps, the stronger it was perceived to be. You might chew a piece of dried mummy, feeling the dry, fibrous texture breaking down in your mouth, the strange, almost sweet and musty flavor filling your senses. It's a full-body assault, involving not just taste and smell, but the tactile sensation of consuming something fundamentally alien. Think about the external applications too. If you were using human fat for a sprain, you wouldn't just slap it on. You might be instructed to warm it first, perhaps over a low flame, creating an even more pungent, unsettling aroma. As you rub the greasy, slightly yielding substance into your skin, feeling its warmth spread, the intimacy of the act is disturbing. This fat, which once cushioned organs and filled the contours of another human body, is now being absorbed into yours. The boundary between self and other, between living and dead, feels dangerously thin, dissolved by the desperation for healing and the strange logic of corporeal medicine. You might be instructed to bandage the area tightly afterward, trapping the heat and the unsettling essence of the remedy against your skin. Zooming out again, while this sounds like pure superstition, it's important to understand the context of the time. Early modern medicine had limited effective treatments for many common and deadly ailments. Antibiotics didn't exist. Surgery was rudimentary and terrifying. Pain relief was minimal. In this landscape of uncertainty and suffering, people clung to any therapy that offered a glimmer of hope, no matter how strange or unpleasant. Physicians, operating with a framework based on humors and vital forces rather than germ theory, genuinely believed these substances held medicinal power. They were applying the principles of sympathetic magic, using parts of the body to influence related parts or functions within what they considered a scientific framework. The persistence of this practice for centuries is a testament to the powerful combination of desperate human need, limited scientific understanding, and the inherent authority of the medical profession, however misguided. Even as anatomical knowledge grew, and some voices began to question the efficacy and ethics of cannibalistic medicine, the sheer weight of tradition and the lack of viable alternatives ensured its survival. It wasn't until the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and empirical observation, coupled with advances in chemistry and pharmacy that offered alternative substances, that the reliance on human remains gradually began to fade. The shift wasn't immediate. It was a slow, uneven decline as new ideas and more effective treatments, like those derived from plants or minerals, understood through emerging chemical principles, slowly replaced the macabre remedies of the past. It highlights how deeply ingrained even the most bizarre beliefs can become when they offer hope in the face of overwhelming suffering and ignorance. And in that unsettling stillness, something truly stark began to stir. But your journey through the shadows was far from over, and what you discovered next was even stranger and perhaps more disturbing. You've lived in a world where consuming the dead is just another item on the doctor's bill, where grave robbers are suppliers and apothecaries are alchemists of human remains. But like all strange and unsettling eras, this one couldn't last forever. Slowly, unevenly, the grip of corporeal medicine began to loosen. The first whispers of doubt weren't necessarily about ethics, those were often secondary to desperation, but about effectiveness. You might take dose after dose of powdered mummy or skull, feel the foul taste, endure the strange texture, and nothing. The fever doesn't break, the seizure returns, the bruise remains stubbornly painful. The promised miracle feels increasingly hollow, replaced by a wearying suspicion that you are merely subjecting yourself to unpleasantness for no tangible gain. Perhaps a physician, meticulously recording patient outcomes, a new idea in itself, starts to notice that remedies based on human remains perform no better, and sometimes worse, than simpler treatments derived from herbs or minerals. The logic that seemed so clear, skull for head ailments, blood for vitality, starts to feel less like inherent truth and more like wishful thinking, or worse, outright nonsense. The sheer physical act of ingesting ground-up humans, once framed by medical authority and desperate hope, might begin to feel less like a path to healing and more like, well, cannibalism, a taboo that even the most desperate might find increasingly hard to ignore as hope dwindled. You might find yourself staring at the dark liquid in the cup, the foul smell suddenly overwhelming, and the question, simple yet terrifying, forms in your mind. Why am I doing this? Zooming out, this shift wasn't a sudden moral awakening. It was a slow grind, driven by several factors. The Enlightenment brought a new emphasis on reason, observation, and experimentation. Medical thinkers began to question the ancient authorities, Galen, Aristotle, upon whose ideas much of corporeal medicine was based. The rise of chemistry offered an entirely new paradigm for understanding substances and their effects on the body. Chemicals derived from plants and minerals could be purified, tested, and their effects observed in a more systematic way than, say, evaluating the vitality of executed criminal blood. Instead of sympathetic magic, the focus shifted to chemical reactions and specific compounds. Crucially, the widespread fraud in the mummy trade also played a significant role. As it became more common knowledge that much of the mummy on the market wasn't ancient Egyptian royalty, but rather recently deceased locals crudely prepared, the mystique dissolved. It's hard to maintain faith in a miracle cure when you realize you've likely been consuming your recently deceased, perhaps plague-ridden, neighbor instead of an ancient pharaoh. The exposure of this gruesome scam undermined faith in all remedies derived from human bodies, staining the entire practice with suspicion and disgust. However, the decline wasn't uniform or immediate. Beliefs die hard, especially when rooted in centuries of tradition and fueled by the constant, unchanging reality of human suffering. Some remedies, particularly those used externally like human fat for salves, or derived from materials less overtly linked to the whole body like skull moss, lingered longer in folk medicine or specific regional practices. The idea of harnessing some property of the human body for healing didn't vanish overnight. It retreated from the formal pharmacopoeia into the shadows of Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, folk remedies. Even today, echoes of this can be seen in obscure, sometimes harmful, traditional practices in various cultures, a testament to the enduring human desire to find cures in the most unlikely and sometimes disturbing places. And in that unsettling stillness, something truly stark began to stir. But your journey through the shadows was far from over, and what you discovered next was even stranger and perhaps more disturbing. The legacy of this practice, while hidden from plain sight, still resonates in unexpected ways. You've navigated the unsettling world of corporeal medicine, seen the bodies become commodities, ingested the bizarre remedies, and understood the complex reasons why such a practice could thrive for centuries. Now, as the direct use of human remains in medicine faded with the rise of modern science, you might think this history is neatly filed away under weird things people used to do. But the legacy of this period is more complex and perhaps more unsettlingly relevant than you might assume. Zooming out one last time, consider the profound shift in our relationship with death and the human body that occurred. The decline of corporeal medicine wasn't just about scientific progress. It also reflected a changing cultural landscape where the dead became increasingly separate from the living, their bodies something to be treated with reverence and distance, not consumed. Cemeteries became more segregated, dissection became confined to medical schools, and the public marketplace for human remains evaporated. The body became a subject of scientific study and ethical consideration, rather than a resource for raw materials. This shift, while positive in many ways, also arguably contributed to a modern disconnect. Where death is often hidden away, medical processes are opaque, and our own bodies can feel like mysterious machines rather than interconnected parts of a larger biological and historical whole. But look closer. Echoes of the mindset that fueled corporeal medicine can still be found in unexpected places. The relentless human desire for health, youth, and vitality, sometimes at any cost, remains a powerful force. While we no longer consume powdered skulls, the multi-billion-dollar industries built around anti-aging, cosmetic surgery, and sometimes questionable supplements tap into that same deep-seated fear of decay and death, and the hope that external or ingested substances can grant us enduring life or perfection. The drive to incorporate animal products into pharmaceuticals, think of things derived from pigs or cows, while scientifically regulated, is a distant, more sterile echo of the idea of harnessing biological materials for healing. Consider, too, the ethical debates surrounding modern medical practices. Issues around organ donation, the use of human tissues for research, the commodification of genetic material. These are all conversations that, in a strange way, pick up threads from the past. We still grapple with questions of who owns the body, what happens to it after death, and how its components can or should be used to benefit the living. While the context and science are vastly different, the underlying tension between the needs of the living and respect for the dead, between scientific advancement and ethical boundaries, is a direct descendant of the issues that were implicitly and sometimes explicitly navigated during the era of corporeal medicine. Furthermore, the very idea of seeking powerful, often mysterious, cures from rare or unconventional sources persists in the world of alternative medicine and health trends. While not involving human remains, usually, the belief in superfoods, detoxes, or elixirs with unproven, often exaggerated benefits, marketed with an aura of exclusivity and ancient wisdom, mirrors the desperate hope and susceptibility to persuasive claims that kept corporeal medicine alive. The fundamental human vulnerability to promises of health, the desire for a quick fix, and the tendency to trust authority figures, whether ancient physicians or modern wellness gurus, are constants throughout history. So, while you won't find Spirit of Skull on your local pharmacy shelf, the history you've journeyed through isn't just a collection of bizarre historical facts. It's a stark, uncomfortable reminder of the lengths to which humans will go in the face of suffering, the complex interplay of belief, desperation, and emerging science, and the enduring questions about our bodies, death, and the ethics of using one to benefit the other. This strange, unsettling chapter of history forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, societal inequalities, and the often frail line between healing and exploitation. It serves as a cautionary tale, a dark mirror reflecting aspects of ourselves that we might prefer not to see, but which are undeniably part of our shared human story. What historical oddity or uncomfortable truth would you like to explore next? You started by wading through the grim reality of apothecaries stocked with human remains, moved through the bizarre specifics of consuming powdered skull and human fat, felt the unsettling intimacy of rubbing rendered grease into your skin, and understood the complex, often bleak, reasons why this practice wasn't just some fringe madness, but a mainstream, centuries-long endeavor driven by authority, tradition, lack of options, and sheer, terrifying desperation. You saw how belief, bolstered by the placebo effect and confirmation bias, created a powerful, self-reinforcing cycle, making even the most nauseating remedies seem plausible. We've traced how it faded, not just because of a sudden ethical awakening, but because science offered alternatives and pervasive fraud finally eroded faith. But as we zoomed out to the present, you saw how the underlying impulses, the relentless human drive to cheat death, to alleviate suffering at any cost, to find potent cures in unusual places, and the complex ethical dance around the use of human bodies haven't vanished. They've simply shape-shifted, taking on new forms in our quest for health and longevity, from the multi-billion-dollar wellness industry to the profound moral questions raised by modern medical technologies. The historical figures who consumed the dead weren't just morbid curiosities. They were grappling, however crudely, with the same fundamental vulnerabilities and desires that still drive us today. This history isn't just about medical oddities. It's a stark, unflinching look at what happens when hope clashes with ignorance, when authority overrules skepticism, and when the human body itself becomes both the source of ailment and the proposed grim remedy. It forces you to confront the uncomfortable truth that progress isn't a straight line, and that even the most deeply ingrained taboos can be bent or broken in the face of overwhelming fear and suffering. So, as you reflect on this journey through the charnel house of historical medicine, remember that the past is not always a comfortable place to visit. It holds mirrors to our own strange desires and vulnerabilities, showing us how easily the line between healing and exploitation can be blurred, and how desperately we cling to any promise of relief, no matter how bizarre or unsettling its origins. If you found yourself captivated, disturbed, or simply wide-eyed at the sheer strangeness of what you've heard tonight, consider sticking around. There are many more overlooked, uncomfortable, and utterly fascinating corners of history waiting to be unearthed. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, only if you genuinely connect with this deeper, stranger dive into history. And let me know in the comments. What historical oddity or uncomfortable truth should we explore next? What dark corner should we shine a light into? Until then, stay curious, question everything, and remember, history isn't always polite. Sometimes it's downright gruesome, and that's often when it's most revealing.